Up next, remembering two difficult times in our nation's history. Stay with us. Hi, I'm Gail Street, your host of Paths to the Present. Today we will recall some painful times in our nation's history. First, we'll look at some of the relief efforts created during the Great Depression, giving rise to public buildings we still use today. Then we'll learn about a county-sponsored bus tour that retraces the steps of the freedom fighters from the civil rights movement. But first, let's do a history quiz. This quiz asks, what did this woman do? Lily Moore Stone lived from 1862 until 1960 in the vicinity of Seven Locks and River Roads. Left a widow in 1921, Mrs. Stone revived a business that lay dormant on her family's property. Evidence of that enterprise can still be seen today. What was that business? And for bonus points, what county institutions did she create? Think you know? Stay tuned. I'll give you the answers at the end of the show. Not unlike today's economic downturn, the Great Depression left a lot of people suffering in its wake. Here in Montgomery County, the people hit the hardest were the farmers. They couldn't sell their produce for what it was really worth. Down County residents were slightly more fortunate. Largely, they were federal employees and didn't experience the massive layoffs felt in other parts of the country. But regardless, times were tough and everyone struggled to make ends meet. To help, the federal government instituted a number of relief programs designed to reform the nation's economy and to make jobs for people who were out of work. The results of two of those Make Work programs are our focus today. In 1932, during the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt envisioned a New Deal. His presidential campaign was designed to give Americans hope for better days ahead. He emphasized the 3 R's: relief for the unemployed and poor, recovery of the economy, and reform of the financial system. Out of this effort came big institutions like the Social Security system, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and Fannie Mae. But remnants of that era are all around us. Claire Kelly explains that in the 1930s, the New Deal brought new buildings as well as murals.
One of the programs was the Public Works Administration program. And this program especially employed engineers and architects and builders. And 2 of the buildings they constructed were high school buildings. At that time in the 1930s, the county didn't have large high school buildings, and in fact, the first building that was constructed was Bethesda Chevy Chase High School, and it was the largest school building in the state at the time that it was built. And the other was the Montgomery Blair High School, built in Silver Spring. And it also is a very monumental building for its time, a very large high school.
The Works Progress Administration was another program. Also known as the WPA, that effort brought 3 new post offices to the county. They were designed to fit in with the existing architecture, using local materials and reflecting regional styles.
In Silver Spring, the post office was built of brick with stone details, a neoclassical style building. And it was patterned after buildings that had been constructed in Silver Spring in the teens and 20s. The fire station, the first and second armories, and there was a county administration building in Silver Spring. They all were brick, classical derived buildings. The second post office that was constructed was the Bethesda post office. And it was built of Stonyhurst stone, which is a local stone quarried nearby, and many buildings in the area had been constructed, both residential and public buildings, of this beautiful, it's a mica schist kind of stone. The third post office was in Rockville. It's quite a monumental post office for its size. It has a corner tower and is built of limestone. and it's patterned after the buildings in Rockville. The courthouse had been constructed some years earlier, and also the Farmers Trust Bank. They're all limestone buildings and very respectful of the county seat.
All three post offices featured interior murals depicting local scenes. This one, in Bethesda's post office, was inspired by the farm woman's market across the street. Rockville's post office still retains its mural featuring Sugarloaf Mountain. Only one of the murals had to be moved.
The mural you see behind me was in the Silver Spring post office, and it's been preserved and moved to the Silver Spring Library. This was a scene in history of a tavern called the Eagle Inn, which stood near Colesville Road and George Avenue during the Civil War era.
Roosevelt's New Deal helped the country cope with grave economic hardships, and in the process, created structures and artwork that tell the story of where we've come from as a county and a nation. Now we move ahead about 30 years to the 1960s. That was a turbulent time for our nation. The civil rights movement had come to a head, resulting in protests which often ended in violence. People gave their lives for the freedom that we enjoy today. To ensure that we don't forget this important era of our American history, the Montgomery County Office of Human Rights sponsors a 5-day bus trip that tours sites important to the civil rights movement. This is an intergenerational tour that happens each year during spring break. We caught up with a few of the people who followed the tour last year, which includes some teens from the Gandhi Brigade, who generously supplied us with video. Early in the morning of April 6, 2009, Montgomery County residents boarded a bus that took them on a tour that would change their lives. Making more than 15 stops in 6 different cities, these travelers were able to walk in the footsteps of civil rights freedom fighters. The trip is the brainchild of Jim Stowe, the director of Montgomery County's Office of Human Rights. He developed it in 2005 when he was doing a similar job in Ohio. Upon coming to this county, he brought the idea with him.
The idea is simply this. We need to be able to touch history in ways that makes it come alive for us. The application, of course, is the fact when we find out what things happen and when they happen and where they happen, now they begin to make some sense to us and how it applies to everyday life as we live it today.
One of the first stops is the Rosa Parks Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. Known as the mother of the civil rights movement, Rosa Parks inspired the nearly year-long bus boycott when she was arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white man. Later that year, in 1955, integrated bus service came to Montgomery.
Well, it's important that we understand our history. We need to know where we came from, what is it that sets up the kinds of social issues that we have today. And this kind of a trip really brings it home. I mean, there's nothing like being able to be in a location versus reading it in a book or having it seen in a film or a dramatic presentation.
Selma, Alabama is the home of the National Voting Rights Museum, where participants learned how the 1965 Voting Rights Act came about. A pivotal moment occurred on this bridge on March 7, 1965. Some 600 civil rights protesters were brutally attacked for marching in support of voting rights. That event became known as Bloody Sunday. It brought national attention to the struggle. 6 months and some more marches later, President Johnson signed the act into law.
I mean, I know I read it in books and in school, but if you're actually there in the area, like where the stuff happens, I think it's kind of like a different feeling.
While in Selma, the group also visited the Slavery Museum, where tour guides simulated what men and women experienced as they were rounded up and forced to be slaves.
I mean, at first, like, when we got off the bus and they lined us up against the wall, we thought it was like some kind of joke, but Then they just kind of like showed what it would be like if you were a slave. And there was definitely like a lot of emotion. And afterwards, there was like a discussion of like how people felt and like, you know, the significance of it.
In Birmingham, Alabama, the bus stopped at the 16th Street Baptist Church, where 4 young girls were killed by a bomb in 1963. This horrific event shocked the nation and served to galvanize support for the movement among all races.
To actually be there and walk into the 16th Street Baptist Church and see where the bomb took place, to hear the stories of what occurred. When you're in that physical presence, it's a totally different experience. So you can bring that experience back to your community. You can share that. It brings more meaning to the kinds of commitment that you have towards creating social change or understanding the conditions of people in your community.
Also in Birmingham is Kelly Ingram Park, which in May of 1963 served as an assembly point for protesters. On that fateful day, police and firemen attacked the demonstrators, many of whom were young people. Dr. King was arrested here, spending 3 days in a Birmingham jail, writing his now famous letter urging nonviolent resistance.
It really like gives you an understanding of like why people are how they are right now, like especially adults. I mean, they'd gone through it, they had seen what happened, and like now they can compare like what it was then to what it was now, actually like retracing the steps.
The tour culminates with a visit to the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Tennessee. It's located at the Lorraine Motel, the site where Dr. King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. While there, you can visit the room in which he stayed and even see the site from where it's believed the fatal shots were fired.
When you actually go to the place that something happened, even though the people are not there, there's something about like, I don't want to say spirit, but like there's something that you feel. I mean, yeah, we hear about Martin Luther King and we celebrate the memorial and people do stuff and all of that, but what if you actually went through that path which he went?
This trip is designed to be a dynamic learning experience from beginning to end, with each stop building on the last.
When you see the whole thing in context, from Atlanta all the way then to Memphis, you clearly understand who was involved. This is our history. This is our U.S. history, our country's history. And so we try to tell that story in a way that makes it meaningful. We try to be sensitive to perspectives and try to tell the whole story.
This year's Civil Rights Educational Freedom Tour runs from March 29th through April 3rd. Contact the Office of Human Rights for more information about this opportunity to walk in the footsteps of those who changed America. So how did you do on the history quiz? Lily Moore Stone was a woman of many achievements. In 1921, at the age of 60, she created Stonyhurst Quarry on her family's property, reviving a business her grandfather began in 1830. Stonyhurst stone was used in many a building, like the Bethesda Post Office, featured in today's show. Mrs. Stone was also considered the founder of the Montgomery County Historical Society. And, if that weren't enough, she designed our county's seal and flag. Well, that's all the time we have for this show. If you have comments for us or ideas for future shows, send an email to paths.present@verizon.net. Be sure and tune in again next time as we follow more paths to the present. See you then.